accomplished many great feats throughout the centuries. When you think about being able to harness the power of electricity and control it so it can go into homes and businesses, you think about simple things like air conditioning, being able to drive in your car. We put a man on the moon, nuclear energy, the atomic bomb. We've accomplished some pretty amazing things. But there's one piece of technology, there's one thing that we have not been able to master yet. We have not figured out how to keep a pre-lit tree lit when one bulb goes out. So for the last 10 years or more, we had a tree. And it promised on the box. I'm not asking for anything that they didn't promise on the box. They promised on the box that when one bulb went out, the section wouldn't go out with it. Liars, all of them. I took every bulb out of that section, replaced it with a good bulb systematically. I used a voltage tester. According to science, that tree should have been lit. And every year, a new section would go out, and we would just put on more and more lights. And here's my thing. If you're going to try to put a guy on Mars, maybe figure out how to keep the tree lit before you send a guy, millions of miles away or however far Mars is. Or start selling trees that are not pre-lit. Just sell the tree. Let me buy the lights separate, and then when those lights go bad, I can just pitch them. But they've got you, and they know that they've got you. Now, there's a simple solution to that, and the solution is just buy a real tree. But I lost that vote in my house 3-1, and here we are with another pre-lit tree. We just put it up last night. Luckily, all the lights were lit, because I didn't know what level of tornado of rage I was going to go into if a brand new tree out of the box was not lit. Now here's what we're talking about today. And it doesn't have as much to do with Christmas or trees, but it does have to do with lights and the way that when one light goes out, it affects the rest of them. You and I, as Jesus followers, are called to let our light shine before men. That's one way that Jesus says it in the Sermon on the Mount. When you were a kid, you learned about this little light of mine, I'm going to let it shine. Ain't going to let Satan it out, I'm going to let it shine. Well, what happens if you don't let it shine? What happens if your light does go out and you're no longer a light for Jesus? We don't usually think about the consequences of that, and we certainly don't think about how it affects the rest of the lights around us. Because when a pre-lit tree, when one bulb goes out, multiple lights are affected. In the same way, if we don't do a good job letting our light shine, more than just us becomes effective. And that's what we're going to talk about today. We're going to be in Philippians chapter 2, verses 12 through 18, continuing to walk verse by verse through this book written by the Apostle Paul while he was in prison in Rome, awaiting his trial before Caesar. Last week, we talked about who Jesus is, rather. We talked about who Jesus is and what Jesus did and how he was glorified because he was willing to humble himself and be obedient unto death, even death on a cross. And so Paul says, in the same way that Jesus lived, you and I need to live. We need to do our best to put others first and to honor one another. And that's the context of the section that we get into, because he begins in verse 12 with a therefore, connecting the two sections together. So because Jesus lived this way, and he was humble and obedient, how should we live? Well, therefore, my dear friends, as you have always obeyed, not only in my presence, but now much more in my absence, continue to work out your salvation with fear and trembling. For it is God who works in you to will and to act in order to fulfill his good purpose. That's very strange language for us to read, that we need to work out our salvation. That's weird in and of itself. Well, how do we work out our salvation? I thought it was a gift. I thought it was grace. I thought it was given to us, but we're supposed to work it out. And the demeanor that we're supposed to use when we work it out is fear and trembling. What is Paul getting at here? I think that Paul is trying to combat a pendulum swinging too far in one direction or the other. It reminds me of an interview that I heard one time with a sportscaster by the name of Howie Long. He's on, I don't know if he's on CBS. I think he's on CBS. Maybe he's on Fox. But he played his entire NFL career for the Oakland Raiders. He was a defensive end. He's a Hall of Famer, so many Pro Bowls. He was one of the best defensive ends of his time. But in an interview, he said every single training camp, every single practice, every single off season, I had it in my mind that I could get cut that year. And so I played and practiced and prepared as if my job depended on it. Now, if you were really to sit down with him, it's like, now, really, Mr. Long, like, you're one of the best defensive ends in the game, and if the Raiders cut you, you're going to end up landing somewhere else. I think you're going to be fine. That's not the way he thought. He was like, I'm going to practice and prepare and get myself ready for a season as if my job depends on it. And that was the mindset that he took in there. And that meant that he didn't take for granted his position on the team, and he didn't just assume that he was going to make it and assume he was going to get better. He was going to work his tail off. He was going to do his part to make sure that he was who he needed to be for his team. Well, the pendulum shift that ends up happening in the Christian movement, and you could take that mindset into it, is once I'm saved by Jesus, I'm saved by his grace, it's a gift, my eternity secure, and now I get to live however I want to live. And there are a lot of professional athletes, it's like, well, once they make it, once they become an all-star, once they get an MVP trophy or whatever it is, then it's like they kind of get lazy and take for granted what it was that got them there. Paul does not want us to take for granted not our work, but Jesus's. He doesn't want us to live with this mindset that, well, now that I've been given this grace and my eternity secure, I can live however I want. Paul's like, that's not the mindset I want you to have. I want you to continue to work out your salvation with fear and trembling. And you hear fear and trembling, it's like, oh my goodness, I'm so afraid God's going to get me. That's not the image he wants you to have, but he wants there to be reverence and respect towards God and towards the sacrifice of Jesus. He doesn't want us to casually think of Jesus' sacrifice and God's grace and go, yeah, that's pretty good. Now I get to go to heaven when I die. He's like, no. Like, Jesus died for you. God became man and died for your sins. That deserves a little bit of respect and a little bit of honor and a little bit of reverence. That's the mindset he wants us to take into our relationship with Christ. Like, don't take it for granted. And it's almost as if he's saying, like, live as if what you do actually contributes to your salvation. Like, honor Jesus' sacrifice by the way that you live. But then he goes on to say, in case you're like, oh my goodness, okay, I got to do better, I got to live because I don't want to go to hell when I die. Well, if Jesus' blood covers you, you're covered. He's already done it for you. And so to make sure the pendulum doesn't swing too far in the other direction towards legalism, he says, for it is God who works in you to will and to act in order to fulfill his good purpose. So as much as we try to work out our salvation with fear and trembling, like, if our salvation depended on us, we're going to flop and flop and flop. We're never going to get there. So he reminds us, God's the one who works in us and who strengthens us, and your job is just to get close to him and allow him to strengthen you to live the way you're supposed to live. But in Paul's day, and I would say even more so in our day, we become too casual with the fact that Jesus came and died and our eternity is secure and now we're going to just live however we want to live. That's a dangerous place to be because it causes you to not only go astray yourself in some way, but to lead others astray as well. So that's kind of a big theological idea that Paul's kind of presenting to us. And then he gets really practical in verse 14. Look at what he says. Do everything without grumbling or arguing. I could just spend the next 20 minutes of our message talking about this. Because I don't know about you, but I sometimes do this. Remember the Christmas tree? That was every year. I got that Christmas tree out. Another section of lights was burnt out. It's supposed to be the most wonderful time of the year. We're drinking hot cocoa, listening to Christmas music. We're getting all excited in the Christmas spirit. And Dad's going crazy because why are these lights going out? Do everything. Not some things, not most things. Do everything without grumbling or arguing? In fact, I was trying to think, okay, well, let's think about my week. Because I knew I was preaching this. I'd been studying it. I've been praying. Okay, let me look back on my week and see how many times did I grumble. And some translations have complaining. That's a good way to understand it. Like, do everything without complaining or arguing. How many times did I complain this week? And I'm embarrassed to even tell you what number I came up with. And I was preaching this. In fact, I was venting about something. I was talking to my wife. I was like, I cannot believe. She's like, well, in Kids Zone this month, the kids are learning to be grateful in all circumstances because there's always something to be thankful for. And I went, I don't care. I want to grumble and argue. I want to complain. I want to be angry right now. Just be angry with me. She's like, well, just think about all the blessings we've received. I'm like, come on. The Greek word actually for grumble or complain here is gongismon, which doesn't even sound like a Greek word. It's not one that I learned when I was in Bible college or seminary. And you're like, well, why are you sharing it with us? Why are you making us learn it? Because it's significant. Because it's not really used in the New Testament. It's used in the Greek translation of the Old Testament. It's called the Septuagint. And it's used all throughout the book of Exodus and Numbers and Deuteronomy to describe the Israelites after they disobeyed God and had to wander in the desert for 40 years. That's the same word that's used dozens upon dozens of times to describe their behavior and the way they complained against God and they complained against Moses. And I just think that's interesting. Because in this passage, verses 12 through 18, a couple of times Paul is going to reference the book of Deuteronomy. And he's trying to get us to think, the Israelites did it wrong. We need to do it right. We have got to get it right. And when they did it wrong, there was a consequence. They were wandering around, and at one point God sent venomous snakes to bite them. And there was just all these stories of how they got it wrong. And the way they got it wrong, it's like they crashed and burned in so many ways. As they were traveling around the wilderness, basically the desert, and they didn't have food, and they didn't have faith that God was going to provide them food, they would say things like, oh, do you remember when we were back in Egypt? And we had more food, like our plates were just spilling over. We had more food than we could eat, and we got to lay in comfortable beds. And like if they really would have remembered correctly, they would have thought things like, we had to work 16-hour days. We got beaten when we didn't do things right. We got beaten when we did things right, but the dude was having a bad day. We had to make our own food. We had to make our own bricks. And they were enslaved in Egypt. And they begged God to get them out. And when he gets them out, they're just going to find something to complain about. And this is the mindset that we have sometimes, and we got to be careful. Because just like they're learning in Kids Zone, there's always something to be thankful for. The flip side can also be true. You can always find something to complain about. Well, what kind of person are you going to be? You get to decide that. It reminds me of Debbie Downer and the SNL skits. No matter what was going on, you could be at Disney World and it could be a beautiful day, but you're going to find something to complain about, something to be angry about. You can find that. You can also find something good to be thankful for in every bad situation. And it's so interesting that Paul is pointing out that there are consequences to doing some things while you complain and argue. But he gives us the reason why. He says, do everything without grumbling or arguing so that you may become blameless and pure, children of God without fault in a warped and crooked generation. In quotes, that's from Deuteronomy. He's pointing us back once again to this is the way they got it wrong. This is the way we need to get it right. Isn't it interesting to think that we will, in a way, stand out without fault in a warped and crooked generation? We will be blameless and pure if we're able to do things without grumbling or arguing. Because in our minds, it seems so trivial and elementary. And it's like, that's really not that big a deal. Because everybody does it. And if you do it too, it's not really going to stand out. But here's the reality. If everybody does it, and you do the opposite, you do stand out. And when he says you'll be blameless and pure, here's the way that I think about this. I could be wrong, So correct me after service if you think I'm wrong, and I can get it right for the 10:30 service. But here's the way I think of it. Sin is sin. Sin always leads us away from God. But it takes a greater distance from God to commit certain sins. Like if you go out and murder somebody in cold blood, that's some distance from God. And that starts with anger or it starts with hatred, and it eventually can lead you to murder. And I'm not saying that anger and hatred are not a big deal, because Jesus tells us that it is. However, to have anger and hatred in your heart and to murder somebody, you've got to be further from God to murder somebody than to experience anger or hatred. The same with having an affair and lust. Like, the further you are from God, the bigger consequences there are from your sin. When he talks about doing things without complaining or arguing, or doing things without grumbling or arguing, he's saying, listen, if we can get this right, the other stuff, like anger and hatred and lust or idolatry or envy, like that stuff is, you're going to be able to get that stuff right too. Because we so casually grumble and argue. It just kind of happens really easily. If we can get that figured out and the condition of our heart changes so that we do that less, you will be blameless and pure. Because all these other areas will be cleaned up as well. You get that area right, which we're so comfortable with, then you're going to get uncomfortable with all these other areas and get those dialed in and on track as well. So we will be blameless and pure, and as a result, second half of verse 15, then you will shine among them, like the pagans, those who don't know Jesus, you will shine among them like stars in the sky as you hold firmly to the word of life. The word of life here, biblical teaching, God's word, but shining among them like the stars. You ever go outside on a clear winter night and you just look up and you just see stars everywhere? We look at the stars and we think, aren't they beautiful? And they are. But when they looked at the stars, they saw a cosmic map when they were traveling or when they were out to sea. The stars gave them an indication as to where they were and gave them the path to where they were going. So you and I can shine among them like stars. Stars can give light off. Stars also point to something else if you know how to navigate all the constellations and you use the stars to your advantage. Well, they would have done that. We don't do that today. Like, you need to find out how to get to somewhere. You just ask Siri, how do I get somewhere? And she gives you turn-by-turn navigation. Never once have I said, man, open the sunroof. I don't know where I'm going. I need to see the stars to figure out my proper... Like, you don't do that. They did. So he's saying you guys are like stars. We are like stars. We're like a navigation system. And we can point people to Jesus, or we can point people to the wrong direction entirely. You ever have a GPS tell you the wrong place to go? Yeah. MapQuest. Remember when we had to print out directions? I can remember when I was in St. Louis, I just moved there, and I was checking in different ministry spots, and so I MapQuested all the directions, had them all printed out, ready to go, and I'm driving around, and I get to this, it's, okay, I'm here right now, because I'm at the corner of these two, and I'm just in an empty lot. And then I realized, as I'm driving around, I don't know if I know how to get back to the interstate, because I was so focused on the directions, I don't really know where I am. And there was no Hey Siri yet. That's how old I am. I had to use MapQuest directions. How many of you had to roll out that map, though, and follow, as you were driving, you had the map rolled out, and just different times. Well, we have the opportunity, by the way that we live our life, to point people to Jesus. Like, this is why Jesus says in the Sermon on the Mount, let your light shine before men, that they may see your good deeds and praise your Father who's in heaven. Like, be something different than the culture. So that when people see it, they notice it, and by the way that you live your life, you can indirectly and then directly through evangelism bring them into a relationship with Jesus. In order to do this, though, like part of that is, the big thing that Paul harps on here, do everything without grumbling or arguing. So we want to point people to Jesus, the way that we interact with our coworkers, the way that we interact with, or deal with conflict, I should say, or deal with curveballs, as major or minor as they are. If we lose our minds on the insignificant moments in life, we don't look any different than the people of the world. And Paul says, you're not pointing anybody anywhere. You're not giving people directions to Jesus. You're leading them astray by the way that you live. And then, Paul says, and then I will be able to boast on the day of Christ that I did not run or labor in vain. Which is to say, church, Philippi, if you guys can make it to the end, then all my missionary journeys and my traveling in the churches that I plant, like if you guys are able to hold on to the end, then I didn't do all my work for nothing. But he says, but even if I'm being poured out like a drink offering on the sacrifice and service coming from your faith, I am glad and rejoice with all of you. So you too should be glad and rejoice with me. Both the pagan religions as well as the Jewish religion, when they had a sacrifice, sometimes they would pour. There are different places in the Old Testament you would see they would pour a drink offering out. So he says, I don't care if I'm being poured out. I don't care if I'm being emptied. I don't care if I lose my life for the sake of establishing your faith. Because if your faith is established, that's all I care about. And I'm going to rejoice if your faith is established. And I want you to be glad and rejoice with me, even if things don't turn out the way that we want them to. If you guys grow in your relationship with Jesus, that's all I really care about. So he says, this is how I want us to think about light. Well, if you think this way about light, like if you're in prison and you're like, you know what, even if I die in prison, I'm going to rejoice if God uses this. And I know God will use it because he promises to use all the bad for ultimate good. Well, what are you going to complain or argue about? Like if you're Paul, you have enough to complain and argue about. Like just read about what he had to endure throughout his missionary journeys. You wouldn't want to see my Facebook feed if I had to go through what Paul did. And right now I'm disciplined. I don't post on there, I had a terrible day because of the tree not lighting up. Because you guys would go, boy, he is pathetic. I don't want to listen to him on Sunday. So I just don't post that stuff. But if I had to go through what Paul did, my Twitter updates would look a little bit different. I wouldn't, my Instagram post would be a little more depressing if I went through this. So he goes through this, and he's like, I'm just going to rejoice because God's moving, and your faith is deepening and being strengthened. And I want you guys to kind of take notes on how I'm dealing with this imprisonment and how I'm dealing with potential martyrdom. Because there's always something to complain about, no matter how good the situation is. There's always something to be thankful for, no matter how bad the situation is. And here's our big idea for today. When your light burns out, you are not the only one affected. See, we think we exist in a vacuum, and that it's like my faith is my faith. And if I do really well and grow in my relationship with Jesus, or I get kind of stagnant and I plateau a little bit, it's my faith. I'm the only one affected. That's not true. The family that you are a part of is affected if your light burns out or starts pointing in a different direction other than Jesus. The people that interact with you regularly, the people who don't know Jesus, who maybe work with you or go to school with you, or you are in the same social club or the same network, you golf with them or you hunt with them, whatever it is. The people that you are around, if your light goes out, they are affected as well. And the church, like the body of believers, we are all affected when one light goes out. Just like that doggone pre-lit tree that is more dark than lit. Whenever that one bulb goes out, the whole section goes. And whenever we do a bad job representing Jesus, the entire congregation can, in a way, suffer. We can have our names tarnished or our branding, our logo, which on one hand I'm like, It's so silly and foolish, but when you're trying to reach shallow people, that stuff matters. And if people have a bad association when they hear Woodlawn Christian Church because they had bad interactions with people, well, now the entire witness of everybody who goes here becomes, in a way, tarnished. I hope we have a basketball season talking about grumbling and complaining. I maybe have done a little bit of that because I've got some seniors that I want to see play. Well, every time I was on the side, whenever I was at a game and I'm sitting next to Gamber, I would feel my blood pressure go up every so often. And if I would start to stand up or I'm a preacher, I can't say that. I need to calm myself down. Because the last thing I need is to get thrown out of a game, especially a home game, and have like Coach Witzel or Mr. Helbig escort me out because I said something I shouldn't have said. Because all of you who would probably be at the game would look and go, I wonder what he's going to talk about on Sunday. Right? It matters. And like, I want to be a part of what goes on in the schools so I can be a positive example and lead students or lead fans or whatever. I want to lead people to Jesus. But listen, if I get it wrong, and even if I get it wrong in a small way, I'm not saying, well, maybe I didn't get kicked out of a game, but maybe I started saying some 4-letter words in anger. I never did, by the way. You're like, is he trying to confess like in a passive-aggressive way? No, I didn't. Never said it. But imagine if I did. How would that affect our players? Like, well, Doug's my pastor, and he talks like that, so I guess I can talk like that. And before you know it, we got the whole team running because they're following the example of the pastor, because Gamber didn't stand for that stuff. So if my light burns out, and I understand I'm in a different position than you are, but if my light burns out, lots of people get affected. But that's true of every single one of us. We have a great responsibility. It's a privilege, I think, but think of it as a responsibility. Your example matters. And you may think nobody's watching, and you may think nobody connects you with our church or connects you, like you're a Christian and no one associates you with this entire movement. But if you've ever liked anything on our church or shared anything from our church, the people that you interact with on social media probably have got that in their memory bank and remember that you're a Jesus follower. And then when you post other things that resemble more complaining, grumbling, and arguing, and 3 posts before you shared something that our church is doing like a coat drive, that can have an adverse effect. Because those two things do not fit together. We got to be careful. And I don't expect you to walk through life and wear unicorn t-shirts and throw up rainbows, and you're like, what are you really wanting from me? Like, this seems like a good lesson for the K to 5th grade group in Kids Zone. Yeah, but when we start talking about real life, and you're like, don't do anything about grumbling or complaining, like, that's my second language. I'm bilingual. I speak English and I speak complaining. Those are my 2 languages, and I'm fluent in both. Paul says, the stakes are surprisingly high. And here's what I want you to think about. To make it hopefully more real and help you to see the significance of the issue. I want you to think about someone in your life that you love, that you've been praying for, someone that doesn't know Jesus. And I want you to think that the way that you live your life actually matters in potentially bringing them into a relationship with Jesus, because it does. This is what Paul wants us to understand. This is what he's trying to drill down in our head. And when he says, work out your salvation with fear and trembling, he wants us to understand how high the stakes are. Maybe not for us. Once you're a Christian, you're good. But for everybody else. And that's the mindset he wants us to take into it. Because when your light goes out, when my light goes out, more than just me or more than just you becomes affected. So this is my challenge to you. Be mindful of what you say and how you interact with people and how you use your social media platforms. Be mindful of these things and start directly with what Paul gives us. Try to do things and say things, and even in the way that you think. Do everything without grumbling or arguing. Let's start there.